Hi, my name is Mike Barrett, and I am very proud and honored to make this presentation to you. Before I begin, can somebody just type in quickly and let me know that you can hear me? I'm pretty sure you can. Pretty sure I clicked the right things. Anybody? Okay. Well, all right, so today's presentation is called How to Self-Study for the SAT or ACT, as you can see. This presentation, though, is actually also going to be highly relevant to pretty much any nationally administered multiple choice standardized test. Thanks, I have people telling me that they can hear me, so that's good. Thanks very much. Anyway, yeah, this presentation is actually going to be relevant to any test like the SAT or SAT. That could include, for instance, if you go into graduate school and take the LSAT or the GRE or whatever, or if you take subject tests for the SAT, which most people will do. So, you know, it's good information to have for all of those things. I would also like to add, if I may, that I strongly encourage you to interrupt me with any questions that you might have, because, you know, I'm basically here to give you all the information that I can, that you need, so take advantage of that. And with that, I will just sort of dive right into the presentation. So before I start explaining what I actually want to talk about, I just want to pause briefly and tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from so that you know who you're listening to and why it might be worth it to pay attention to what I have to say. So I've always been pretty good at taking standardized tests, and for the last, I guess now, wow, gosh, I'm old. Really for about 15 or 16 years informally, but for about the last 10 to 11 years formally, I've been helping people with standardized testing. Started out with the PSAT and the SAT, quickly moved into the ACT and so on. I have some channels on YouTube, or I should say one channel on YouTube, some videos on YouTube you may be interested in. For instance, there's a video on there or a set of videos on how to do the SAT essay. That advice, by the way, also applies almost 100% to the ACT essay and so on. So you can poke around and find those things if you want. But more importantly, the reason that I think it's kind of worth listening to me, and something that I hope you'll keep in mind no matter whose test-taking advice you take down the line, is that everything I say can be tested against real test questions. And this is a very important thing to keep in mind, again, for all test preparation. Oh, sorry, thanks for the question, Lydia. I have a question coming in from Lydia. It says, what is your YouTube channel? And I'm actually not sure. I believe it's called Testing is Easy. Like if you look down in the bottom corner, or maybe for your direction it's that way, I don't know. One of the bottom corners of the slide deck in front of you, you'll see a little logo that says Testing is Easy, and I believe the name of the YouTube channel is Testing is Easy, all one word. But if you just Google my name, which is Mike Barrett, and then like SAT essay, or actually I think if you even just Google the phrase SAT essay on the first page, you'll find links to my videos, or you used to. It's been a while since I've done that, but anyway. So yeah, you can find some videos on there. But again, more importantly, I really want to always come back to this idea of testing what you hear when somebody gives you testing advice. One of the really nice things about the SAT and the ACT and all these tests is that it's very clear and obvious and objective when something is right or when it's wrong. So if someone gives you a certain type of advice and says, you know, on these types of math questions, you can always do this with a calculator, you can just believe them, but it's much smarter to go and actually try that advice against real test questions and see, you know, is that actually true? And if it's true, great, then you can believe them. And if it's not true, then you should ignore that advice. So again, you know, happy to share a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from. But ultimately what matters is when I say something, is it true? And that's the same thing that should matter for any source of test prep advice that you decide to follow. All right, anyway, enough about that. As I just said, you should always verify, can't talk, always verify advice that you get. Oh, one other thing I just want to clear up before I continue too much further. You may see on the screen my eyes kind of darting around. I have a lot of different things in front of me right now. I have your chat questions. I have my own face looking back at me, which is very distracting. But, you know, that's part of life, I guess. And then I have a slide deck, and in front of me I also have like a little display of what slides are going to appear before they appear for you. So if you see my eyes kind of moving around, that's what I'm doing. Okay, anyway, with that said, let's actually start talking about test preparation, which is what we're all here for. Okay, so when you talk about taking a test, a standardized test in particular, it's really, really critical to focus on the things that you are doing incorrectly. Most people just sort of, instead of doing that, they look at something like the SAT or the ACT and they say, well, okay, this is a general test of math knowledge and maybe vocabulary and reading and science knowledge and whatever. So I guess if I want to get better at those things, I should get better at those topics, and that'll make me better on the test. Which sounds reasonable, but it's actually not correct. So the thing about these tests, and we'll get back to this idea, but the thing about these tests is that they are designed to perform a very specific task, which is to measure the same skills in every single person they're given to over and over and over again, year after year. So if you keep just trying to take the same amount of knowledge or even more subject matter knowledge and just throwing that against the test over and over and over again without actually stopping to think how the test actually works, the test is literally designed so that if you do that, you'll keep making essentially the same mistakes and you'll keep getting essentially the same score. This is why so many people can retake the SAT or the ACT time and time again, and they might go up a little bit or down a little bit from time to time. Even with a lot of preparation, if the preparation is poorly directed, they might still only go up a little bit or down a little bit from time to time, test after test. It's because they're not really getting into what the test is actually about. You know, they're focusing on what the test seems to be about, the subject matter, but they're not actually learning how the test wants you to answer certain questions. And again, because these tests are designed to do the same thing over and over and over again, that's why they're standardized. Since that's how they're designed, if you don't catch on to what that is, or somebody doesn't explain it to you, or you don't sort of just naturally get it on your own, it's not going to get better on its own. It needs to be something that you specifically pay attention to. So, as I said, you'll just make the same mistakes over and over again if you don't fix them, which is why I strongly advise you in your preparation to spend at least as much time thinking about mistakes you've already made and figuring out how those could be avoided in the future. I would do that at least as much as I would actually take more tests. Most people who are sort of, let's say, very serious, very motivated test takers who want to get the highest score that they can, they'll just sit and take the test over and over and over and over and over again out of a book like the Blue Book, or which is the SAT sort of official book, or the Red Book, which is the ACT's official book. They'll just sit and go question after question after question, and then get score after score after score. It's basically the same. So you don't want to just pour yourself into taking practice tests. It's good to have that motivation, and it definitely indicates a high degree of desire and a high degree of drive, all of which is wonderful. But if you don't stop to think, what am I doing here and why isn't this working sometimes, you will, again, just constantly make the same mistakes and constantly get the same score. So again, please plan to spend at least as much time analyzing mistakes as you do actually taking the test. Now, we need to know, therefore, what causes your mistakes. And most people incorrectly assume when they make a mistake that they've made the mistake because they didn't understand a question. This is sometimes correct, but it's very, very often not correct. It's not nearly as correct as often as people think. The classic example of this is kind of two, one for the SAT, one for the ACT. The classic example on the ACT is that someone looks at an ACT science question that seems to be about, I don't know, the quantity of ice on the planet Pluto and whether it's made out of methane or water or whatever. And then they miss the question and they go, well, I never studied Pluto or methane, so I can't possibly have known the answer to that. Or on the SAT, they see a sentence completion question that has a couple of words that they're not familiar with, and they say, well, I can't answer this because I don't know these words. There is, again, some level of subject matter knowledge on all of these tests, but it's not nearly as high of a level as people tend to think. So, for instance, in my hypothetical ACT science question that I just made up, if you were to have a question about the level of ice on Pluto or whatever, you always need to think when you see something like that. You should think to yourself, well, this is a test that is given to high school students all across the country, and it's designed to say something meaningful about their level of achievement in something, so that schools can look at those scores and say, well, this person might be a good fit for us, this person might not, whatever. So the questions, therefore, need to be sort of relevant in a way to something that a college might care about. Colleges don't care, for the most part, if you know anything about the ice composition on Pluto. By the way, I'm assuming that there even is ice on Pluto. I don't have any idea if there is or not. So the question about that, or the question that seems to be about that on the ACT, is not really testing whether you already know that. Instead, on the ACT science section, what's being tested is whether you can look at the given information and find the answer there. And that actually is a useful skill. It's a skill that a college might care about, right? But it involves almost no subject matter knowledge. The only subject matter you have to know is how to read, how to look at a graph, how to find maybe numbers on a chart or words on a table or whatever it might be. But that sort of broad skill can be applied over and over again in a variety of different scenarios. And that's why the ACT science section, as an example, can test the same skill set over and over and over again, even though it uses questions about different subjects, supposedly about different subjects. The reason, again, the subject matter plays almost no part in the role, or I should say that again, plays almost no role at all in what's actually being tested on the question. For the SAT example that I gave a minute ago with sentence completion questions where you may or may not know certain words, it's perhaps more helpful on the sentence completion questions to know some of the words. And for sure, if you could go through a sentence completion question and know all the words, that's usually easier than if you don't know. But we'll see very frequently that people often miss questions on the sentence completion, even if they knew all the words they needed to know. And they often get questions right, even if they didn't know all the words that they needed to know. So there's more to those sentence completion questions than simply the words that you know and the words that you don't know. I can tell you I've gotten a perfect score on the SAT many times, both in real life and in practice. And I've never once gone through an entire test and known the meaning of every single word. There's usually several words that I don't know the meaning of. So I'm not saying you have to do it that way or whatever, just that it's possible. So the subject matter knowledge needs to be de-emphasized. Here's the subject matter that you do need for these tests. You need to know, some of this is going to sound kind of silly, but I'm giving it to you straight for a reason. You need to know how to read, very seriously, because, reading English will be critical. For a native speaker of English, that sounds kind of like an obvious thing. For foreign speakers, non-native students, that's going to be perhaps a bit more of a challenge, but that is critical. The tests are written in English. You know how to read English. That needs to happen. You need to know on the SAT basic arithmetic, basic geometry, and basic algebra. On the ACT, you need those things plus basic trigonometry, which is just the definitions of terms like cosine, sine, and so on. And on both tests, you need fairly simple knowledge of written American English grammar and style. But that's only if the schools you're applying to care about the writing sections. On the SAT, some schools will just not even count the writing section. On the ACT, it's usually a part of the overall score that the school will look at. So you need relatively basic skills, but beyond that, nothing. Certainly you don't need any advanced math. I would argue you need not really that much of an advanced vocabulary. Again, if you have it, it's not going to hurt, but it's not necessary by any means. You certainly don't need any science knowledge for the ACT. Let me rephrase that. Sorry, I want to catch myself. On the ACT, there may be 1 or 2 or possibly even 3 questions on a given test that might actually involve outside scientific knowledge. That can happen. But of the 40 questions on the ACT science section, let's say at least 37 of them will not require any outside knowledge. And usually it'll be 38 or 39 or even 40 that don't require any outside knowledge. So you can still hit a score like in the 30 plus range on the ACT without knowing any science except what they actually teach you right there in the passage when you answer the questions. So again, subject matter knowledge is important in real life. Definitely I'm all for being well read and knowing as much stuff as you can know, just for being a regular walking around human being and getting a nice experience out of this existence. But in terms of the SAT and the ACT, has very, very little practical application outside of what I just mentioned. Now, again, the reason for this, very important to keep in mind, the reason for this is that the standardized tests are designed to do something different from what school tests are designed to do. School tests are mostly designed to measure your subject matter knowledge. That's what a history test does, right? If you take a history class and they give you a quiz on something, the point of the quiz is to see how much history you managed to learn between passing notes and looking at your phone and whatever else it is that you're actually doing. So that's what we think of a test as, we think of those school tests. But the subject tests, let me say that again, the standardized tests, even the subject tests for the SAT, standardized tests are filling a different role. The goal there is not strictly to measure how many words you know, how much science you know, whatever. The goal is simply to generate some number for a score that can be meaningfully compared to all other scores that have been generated by the same test going backwards in time or forwards in time until they change the whole style of the test to the next thing. So for instance, the current version of the SAT has been in existence since I believe it was the beginning of 2005. I want to say it was March 2005, something like that. all SAT tests given from that day in 2005 until now and until the next version of the SAT comes out in a couple of years, whenever that is, they all measure exactly the same things. They're all designed to do that. The only way that that is possible is to keep let me say that again. The only way to keep it possible and useful in a meaningful way is to keep the content that's on the test very basic. If the content is not basic, if it's like advanced calculus one day on the math section and advanced statistics on another day on the math section or whatever, you're going to have a problem. You would have a problem if you were the College Board, because the results from a test like that would be basically useless for colleges. If you took all of the high school seniors right now in America and you gave them a test on advanced statistics, the ones who are in advanced statistics classes might do pretty well on it, but everybody else would do poorly. And you wouldn't know from the results, okay, did this person do poorly because he's bad at math in general, he's bad at thinking about math, it's not his thing, or did he do poorly because this is a test on subject matter he's never seen before in his life? You would have no way of knowing, and again, the test would be useless. So the SAT and the ACT need to be designed so that, in theory, any test taker, whoops, my light just went out. Here I am. Okay, so sorry. They need to be designed so that, in theory, any test taker has the potential to answer every question correctly. In other words, it must be that every test taker knows enough stuff to answer basically all of the questions correctly, otherwise the test, again, would be useless. So the way that you make that happen, if you're the College Board or the ACT, is you ask questions about basic concepts, but you combine those concepts in weird ways. You present them in ways that the test taker will never have seen before. And then what you're really testing is how well can this person look at this question, which is about stuff that they probably know, and figure out how they know it, combine those ideas that they're familiar with, and solve the question. And again, that is actually highly relevant to what a college would care about, right? That's highly relevant to thinking skills and stuff like that. The reason why so many test takers don't do so well on it, even though they're very good at thinking and they know a lot of stuff, is because they're not looking at it like that. They've been told that the test is a subject matter test and they should memorize vocabulary and study science and do all that other stuff. And they do that, and it doesn't help very much anyway, and it never occurs to them to think, oh, maybe there's a different way of looking at this question. So again, subject matter knowledge can play a role for sure. If you have a question on a math section or something and it's about finding the area of a square and you don't know how to find the area of a square, you will not be able to answer the question probably, right? That's definitely true. But most people taking the test will know how to find the area of a square. They might miss the question because they don't read it carefully, or because they didn't realize it was asking for the area of a square, or who knows what. So anyway, again, it's all about basic ideas presented in strange ways. Very important to keep that in mind. So when you're looking at a question, you want to say to yourself, what are the actual concepts that are in this question? Not, have I done this exact type of thing before? Because the answer usually is going to be no, you haven't. You haven't read that exact passage if it's a passage question. You haven't studied this exact topic in science if it's an ACT science question. You haven't done this exact math problem if it's a math problem on either test, and so on. For the most part, you will never have done the exact thing the way it's presented on the test. Whoops, I have a question. Excuse me one second. This is coming in from Catherine. Ooh, okay, I'm going to put myself on pause for a minute. Catherine has a question. Very good. The question is there any benefit to skipping a question? I'm guessing that this is sort of related to the whole concept of guessing on these tests. And I'm actually very glad you asked that, Catherine, because, well, there's a lot to be said about that. So this is something that is highly misunderstood, in my opinion, by a lot of test takers. So on the SAT, for instance, you are penalized for being wrong, meaning that if you get one raw point for every question you answer correctly, then every time you answer a question incorrectly, you lose 1/4 of a raw point. And the idea behind this, Catherine, is that the wrong answer penalty supposedly should cancel out any positive benefits that you might be able to get from guessing. The idea is if you guess, let's say you have 10 questions in a row, you guess randomly on all 10 questions, there's 5 answer choices on each one. In theory, you should be right 2 times and wrong 4 times. So you're going to get 2 points for being right, and then the test figures, well, they're going to be wrong 8 times. I think I said 4 before. I mean 8. Excuse me. They're going to be wrong 8 times, because 4 out of 5 times, up to 10 questions is 8 questions. So they're going to be wrong 8 times. If we take away 1/4 of a point each time, then those negative 2 points we took away will exactly counterbalance the 2 points that they got by guessing that they shouldn't have gotten, and it all zeroes out. And that's the theory. So there's a certain theory out there a theory I call the traditional guessing strategy. And the traditional guessing strategy says that you should guess if you can eliminate a certain number of answer choices. Some people say only one answer choice on the SAT. Some people say two, whatever it is. And the theory is if you're only going to be penalized like you were correct one time in 5, if you can guess from 3 things or 4 things, or even better would be 2 things, then you're going to be right more often, and the penalty won't totally match up to the number of points that you get. And there should be a little bit of a margin between how many things you answer correctly and the number of points that are taken away from that. And you should come out ahead a little bit. That's sort of the idea. There's a problem with that. Mathematically, there's no problem with it. Mathematically, it's pretty true that if you guess from a smaller number of things, you're more likely to be correct. There's no doubt about that. The problem is that this argument makes assumptions that are not valid. It's based on 2 assumptions primarily. The first assumption is that you will be able to eliminate wrong answers even if you can't answer the question. And that seems like something you should be able to do, but most people actually are not very good at doing it. And here's why, and it kind of ties back into what we were just saying about how the test is designed. This test, again, both of these tests are designed to be given to millions of people every year, measure the same thing, blah, blah, blah. They have to be designed in a multiple choice format because multiple choice is the only format that allows you to be totally exact and precise when you score it for millions of people. If it were like an open-ended essay kind of format, then the essay grading process has certain, how can I put it? Well, there's certain subjective elements, right, in grading an essay, and there's no way you could grade 2 million essays a year to the same degree of exactness. I know you might be thinking, but both of these tests have essays. They do, and they're graded very poorly for this exact reason, and the essays are not graded very precisely. The more subjective the process is, the less precise the grading can be. So that's why the essays are graded like 1 out of 6, or basically out of 12, but it's more or less 1 out of 6 times 2. Whereas the SAT and the ACT can be graded very specifically. The SAT can be graded like a 510 versus 520 versus 530, and those are all meaningful distinctions. And on the ACT, like a 31, 32, 33, 34, again, all meaningful distinctions. That's only possible because of the high degree of accuracy that's permitted by the multiple choice format. Now, to go back to what I was saying, with the whole idea of guessing on the multiple choice questions, part of the multiple choice format it's a major weakness actually, and it's something that's very important for us to think about. When a test company puts a multiple choice question in front of you, they have to include the correct answer in the choices, obviously, right? If there's no correct answer, then you can't answer the question, which makes it a pointless question. So one of the answer choices must be the correct answer. This means there's always going to be a danger that a test taker could look at a question and look at the answer choices and be like, well, I don't actually know this, but I just kind of like the letter B, so I'm going to pick B and maybe I'll be right. And sometimes that'll work and they will be right. So the College Board and the ACT both are very tricky and manipulative in the way that they create wrong answers for questions. Like if it's a math question, for instance, they don't just sit back and go, well, okay, if the right answer is 17, I'm just going to make some of the wrong answers be, I don't know, like 98 and 105.6 and pi over the square root of 13, whatever. They don't do that. Instead, they look at the question, and if the correct answer is 17 for whatever reason, they sit and they think, well, what are all the ways that somebody might mess this question up? If they were nervous, if they were bad at math, if they're kind of in a hurry for whatever reason, they hit the wrong button on their calculator. What kinds of mistakes could they make? And then I'm going to take the things that seem most likely to me as the test maker, and I'm going to make those mistakes be the wrong answers on the question. So now, Catherine, if you're looking at this question and you don't know how to answer it, you're not just looking at one correct answer and 4 kind of randomly chosen things. You're looking at one correct answer and 4 things that are specifically designed to trick a person like you who doesn't know how to answer the question. I mean, not you personally, Catherine, but you, anyone, me, whoever's looking at the thing. If we're looking at a question we can't answer, you got to keep in mind the 4 wrong answers are designed to trick somebody just like you. And it might be that not all 4 of them trick you. It might be that only 1 or 2 of them seem appealing. But whatever it is, the test is specifically trying to mislead you. So when we go back to that assumption for the guessing thing, one of the assumptions, again, is people will be able to eliminate wrong answers even when they can't answer the question, and that's actually a lot harder than it sounds like it would be. For the math questions, we just talked about why, but for the reading questions, the English, the science on the ACT, most of the wrong answers are based on misreading, misunderstanding, skipping a word maybe, or looking at the wrong part of a passage or the wrong chart or whatever it is. And it's very easy to fall for one of those traps if you don't totally get the question. And if you got the question, you wouldn't need to be guessing because you would know the answer. You would just mark it down. So again, the first assumption is that people can reliably eliminate wrong answers. And sometimes it's possible, for sure, sometimes. But way more often than you might think, it's not very likely to happen. The second assumption that's even more not true, let's say, or even less true would have been a better way to say that. The second assumption is that people will guess randomly, right? Because when we talk about answer choice distributions and the probability of being correct, it's, you're guessing from one and two things, a 50% chance or whatever. All of that assumes that you're going to guess randomly. If you don't guess randomly, then the whole idea of probability doesn't even enter into the discussion. And most people don't guess randomly. Most people look at a question. If they can't answer it, they say, okay, well, I don't really know about this, but I'm pretty sure that like D and E are ridiculous, so I'm not going to pick them. And then out of A and B and C, I think A looks the best, so I'm going to pick A. Nothing about that is random. That is a directed decision that you make based on what you think you understand about the question. And again, you have to remember, the question is designed to make you think you understand parts of it that you don't understand. If you can't find the answer to a question on the SAT or ACT, you probably are either overlooking or misunderstanding something, or something in there is not going right. For most people, if you make a guess at that moment, the guess will be wrong. And the frequency of guessing correctly will usually be much less than 1 in 5. Not for every test taker. Some people, for whatever reason, are just really good at it. In my life, maybe I've met like 3 of them personally, so not a ton. There's a chance you might be one of them. It could always happen. So what you should do, in my opinion, is when you do your practice tests, first of all, make sure you only do practice tests from the real testing company. So if it's the SAT, only from the College Board. If it's the ACT, only from the ACT. That's what they creatively decided to call their company, the same name as the test. So you should only do practice tests from those companies, because those questions will be official and they'll work exactly like real questions because they are real questions. And in your practice sessions, note to yourself, how often, when I guess, am I right? If I'm right often enough on the SAT that I would outpace the wrong answer penalty, then probably I should keep guessing. But for most people, that will not be true. The compliment to the whole guessing thing, Catherine, is what you actually asked about, which is the idea of skipping a question. If you don't guess, I think you should skip. You kind of can't do anything else, right? You're either answering with certainty because you know the answer, or you're guessing because you don't know the answer with certainty, or you're skipping. That's pretty much the only options. So I would absolutely skip a question on the SAT if I didn't know the answer. On the ACT, there is no specific penalty for being wrong. So on the ACT, if I leave a question blank or if I put the wrong answer, the impact on my score is exactly the same, unlike on the SAT. For the ACT, therefore, you should answer every question, but the idea that guessing is likely to increase your score significantly, it's unlikely to happen. It could, by luck. Statistically, there's got to be a few people out there every day who do manage to make that happen. I mean, every test day, who do manage to guess their way to a higher score than they should have. But realistically, as a solid strategy, I would not advise it. And that actually gets into something else on the topic of guessing, and that kind of a little bit segues back into the topic of the talk a little bit more. And that is this. These tests, the SAT and the ACT, they are designed so that every single question has exactly one correct answer. And I know when I say that, I probably sound like I don't know what I'm talking about. If you've done any kind of practice or whatever, you'll often hear people talk about like the best answer to a sentence completion question or a passage question, or like, they'll look at a math question and say, well, you could interpret it this way, you could interpret it that way. If you interpret it this way, the answer is 5. If you interpret it that way, it's 32.5 or whatever. But actually, none of that is correct. If you know how the test works, if you know the sort of rules, let's say, of the test, which can be found by, looking at a lot of questions and thinking about it. If you know that stuff, there is always exactly one correct answer to every question, without argument. And again, it must be that way if you think about it. These tests are given approximately 2 million times each every year, or maybe it's 1.5 million, whatever. Basically, millions and millions of times is the important thing. They're given every year to millions of people, and colleges find the scores to be worthwhile and reliable, right? Which means if you apply to wherever and you've got a 730 on the math on the SAT, the college has a very high degree of confidence that that 730 is basically the same as a 730 from somebody who applied 2 years ago, which means it's basically better than like a 690 from somebody who applied the previous month or whatever it is. The only way that the scores can have that high degree of accuracy and objective reliability is that the test is very precise. Now, I'm not saying that to defend the tests. Personally, I think we'd probably all be better off if these tests didn't exist and there was some other better way to do it. But at the moment, that is not the case. At the moment, schools use the tests. And again, they use them because they find the results to be highly reliable. And again, that's only possible because there's exactly one correct answer. So when we talk about these guessing ideas, a major problem with the whole guessing point of view is that it encourages you to think that there's no correct answer to the question, or that it's like arguable, right? And we've all had, I think, those kinds of experiences in school. I still remember one high school history teacher who was a better teacher than I thought at the time, but who still made a lot of mistakes. And one thing that always used to happen in her class is that she would give us these tests, and then there'd be multiple choice usually, and at the end of the test, or like when the tests were going to be handed back or whatever, we would like discuss each question, and if you could convince her that an answer choice that she had said was wrong was kind of correct, she might give you half credit or full credit or whatever. And I kind of get that, like history is subjective, it's interpretive and so on, that's great. But it's a very bad test-making practice. If you're going to make a multiple-choice test, you should make it so that every question has only one correct answer. Teachers in school do not usually do that, but the SAT and ACT always do that. Always, with no exception. There is always one correct answer. And it happens even to me once in a blue moon that I think there might be two answers or no answers or something like that. We're always wrong when we think that. There's always one correct answer. You have to train yourself. Always one correct answer. You always look for that. So this guessing idea encourages you not to think like that, and it costs you points in that way, perhaps even more than it costs just from actually losing points on guessing. You know, you don't want to think of the test as this unpredictable, unfair, kind of subjective, interpretive, wishy-washy thing. Maybe it's unfair in its own way, but it's highly predictable. Highly, highly predictable. You just want to figure out how it works, and that, again, is one of the things we're talking about doing in this presentation. So just to catch up for people who I see have just joined, Catherine just asked a question, which I appreciate very much. I strongly encourage all of you to ask as many questions as you might have. I love working with people and talking to people, so by all means, please go ahead and do that. It can be on topic, it can be off topic. Hopefully still related to like college or the SAT or something, not about personal things, but you know, anything really is fine. This presentation that I'm giving is similar to one that I've given for College Week Live in the past, and the video for that is up on their website. So, you know, if for whatever reason we don't get to finish this talk, you could see the talk in its entirety on that link. So, so please don't feel like you're going to derail me or anything like that. You know, I am here to answer your questions. So, Catherine, please let me know if you have any follow-ups to that, or if I didn't answer it. And anyone else, again, please feel free to chime in. Okay, with that said, on to the next slide. So I want to give actually an example of how this whole subject matter thing can work. How a question can appear to be a subject matter question, but not actually be a subject matter question. Whoops, one moment, sorry. Input coming in. Thanks. Yeah, Catherine says she agrees with the subjectivity remark about the written essay. Yeah, that's a real problem. Actually, along those lines, for anybody curious about the essay, again, you can look at my YouTube channel, or if you just Google, I think SAT essay, I'm pretty sure I'm the first like video result that comes up. It might not be on the first like #1 result, but somewhere on the first page there's a video, and it's the first of my 3 video series, I believe. The essay grading process on these tests is weird. It's, again, fairly predictable, also fairly subjective, and fairly not arbitrary. But anyway, it's poorly designed in my opinion. You'll often have situations where an essay that's not very well written gets a perfect score, whereas an essay that is extremely well written from like a literary standpoint might only get a 7 or 8 out of 12. But the things that determine what gets a high score on the essay are fairly consistent and fairly predictable. Not as consistent and predictable as the multiple choice questions, which are 100% predictable, but fairly. And I encourage you to look at those videos. You can also ask questions in here if you want, but those videos have a pretty thorough presentation on how all of that stuff works. The basic gist of it is there are certain elements that you want to include in your essays. The graders seem to be looking for those and only those. And anything outside of those elements, they don't really seem to care about that much. So if you include those elements and write sentences that are halfway legible, sorry, not legible, I shouldn't say that, write sentences that are halfway grammatically okay, then usually you'll get a 10 or an 11 or a 12. But if you don't include those elements, it doesn't matter how good the rest of the writing is, you typically will not make a 10 or 11 or 12. Which again, all goes back to the whole standardization and sort of the ridiculous things that the standardization requires these testing companies to do, and so on. Anyway, let's talk about this example here. So this example that's on your screen right now is very, very close to an example that actually appears on the subject test, the SAT subject test in, I believe, American history. It could appear on either test, American or world, but I'm pretty sure it's from American history. It's not word for word the same, but the concepts are the same. So the question looks like a very subject matter intensive question. And it looks like something where if you wanted to answer this, you would first of all have to know a decent bit or decent amount about Abraham Lincoln. And also you would have to have the same opinion as the person who wrote the question in determining what was Abraham Lincoln's greatest accomplishment as a leader. So it seems like a very challenging question, subjective, subject matter intensive, and so on. But actually, if we look at these answer choices, choice A talks about getting the South to apologize for the Civil War. That never happened. The South never formally apologized for the Civil War. So A can't possibly be correct. We don't need to know anything about Abraham Lincoln to know that. We just need to know that at no point did the South ever apologize for the war. For B, about the Reconstruction policies through Congress, for that we could simply know that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated before the Reconstruction policies were put into place. So there's no way that he could have been involved in B. C might sound kind of like an open-ended thing, who knows. D talks about signing a trade agreement with China. Well, we could know that trade agreements with China were not part of American policy until much, much, much later, over a century later. And for E, I believe over a century. And then E, the Federal Reserve System, same thing, it didn't exist at the time. So this question seems at first like it's very Abraham Lincoln intensive, but actually it's not. What the question is really asking is, because the correct answer to this would be C, by the way, only because the other four things are pretty ridiculous. If you've been studying American history for a while, you kind of probably can tell that. Now, if instead of these, if the question had had 5 actual accomplishments of Abraham Lincoln, for instance, I don't know, winning an election, putting into effect the Emancipation Proclamation, and so on, those things would have made the question a lot harder. In fact, they would have made the question unanswerable and unaskable from an SAT standpoint, because then it would have been a subjective judgment call about, well, which one of these things do you think is best? You know, I could say it's one thing, you think it's another, and there's no solid answer. In this case, only one of these 5 choices actually happened at all. The other 4 are things that an American history student with sort of, let's say, intermediate-ish knowledge of American history would be able to be like, well, the South never apologized for the Civil War. A can't be right. The Reconstruction happened after Lincoln was dead. That can't be right. You know, that kind of thing, without actually knowing anything about Abraham Lincoln. I even had to make this example, I even had to go outside the SAT and the ACT, because those tests are so limited in their subject matter that they can even ask about, again, basic math, the ability to read English, and relatively basic English grammar and things like that. I couldn't even find an example that was sort of like deceptively subject matter based, but not. I had to go to the American history subject test, I believe it's American history subject test from the SAT, to even be able to find a question where I could kind of show you, okay, it looks like it's about one thing, but actually it's about something else. So keep this kind of thing in mind. The average test taker who missed this question would say, oh man, I thought I knew a lot about Abraham Lincoln, but I have to go back and, I don't know, reread his Wikipedia page or read a biography on him or something, because I guess they can just ask all kinds of obscure things about Abraham Lincoln. That's what it seems like. But we as trained test takers would know, no, they can't ask that kind of thing, because that would make the questions useless. They have to be asking about basic concepts. So if the question doesn't seem basic at first, there's got to be some way to apply relatively basic knowledge and arrive at one correct answer. This again is true whether it's a math question, whether it's a passage-based reading question, science question, whatever it might be. All right, so let's talk then about how we actually try to move forward with this. You will miss questions sometimes, probably most people will, because they don't know a fact. And that again could be the formula for the area of something, or how to calculate a percentage, or when to use a semicolon. You can miss questions for those reasons, absolutely. But most of the time, if you look with open eyes, you will see that you actually probably know a lot more about individual questions than you think you do. And most test takers, if they could go back and look at their questions, would find that they've missed, would find that they actually knew enough to answer most of them. Maybe not all, in some cases all, but maybe not all. But again, more of them than you might think. For sure, if you're familiar, for instance, with basic algebra, by which I mean, solving for variables and stuff like that. If you're familiar with basic geometry, like calculating the area of two-dimensional figures, or I don't know how many angles there are, or degree measurements in the angles of a triangle that adds up to 180, that kind of stuff. And basic arithmetic, like the difference between even numbers and odd numbers, positive versus negative, that kind of stuff. If you know that material, you can literally answer every single SAT math question you ever run into. Now, some of them look much harder than that. I'm not disputing it. They look very hard sometimes. But that's all they're ever allowed to ask about, is concepts from those three basic areas of math. So if you're in like a pre-cal class or a trig class or geometry 2 class and algebra 2 class, you have had the material at almost any school. Everybody has slightly different curricula, but basically, if you're at that level, you would have had the material to be able to answer every single SAT math question. Even if you've only had geometry 1 and arithmetic, you could still answer most of the math questions, not things that depend on algebra, but the other stuff for sure. So again, it's going to look often like there's something you don't know that you need to know, but more often than that, it's actually going to be that you knew what you needed to know and didn't see how to apply it. Let's see some further, hold on a minute, I'm trying to hit next on my thing here. There we go. Okay. So the biggest thing that you want to pay attention to when you're trying to diagnose your mistakes, and when you're looking at a question on test day or in practice or whatever, and trying to diagnose the question itself, the biggest thing by far are all these little small details that most test takers pay no attention to, right? If you could sort of sit down with the average test taker and go through their entire performance on an SAT or an ACT, you would find that most of the time they don't read very carefully, they don't check their math, they don't check anything really, and as a result they tend to miss questions. And this kind of thing is fine in school. In school, generally speaking, if a teacher asks you, I'm just making something up, if she asks you your interpretation of a passage or something like that in a novel, you can be a little bit wrong, by which I mean you can say something that isn't directly reflected in the passage, or it varies a little bit or whatever. You can kind of give your opinion, your emotional response to it. And teachers are fine with that. In fact, a lot of them actually want you to do that. That's why they're asking, right? But let's say instead that the SAT asks you what's going on in this passage. If you give an answer that is the slightest bit different from what the passage said, you will be completely incorrect. So if you give an answer that's a little bit, your interpretation, your take on it, in school, that would be encouraged. On the SAT, that is completely wrong. In school, you can fudge the details a little bit or be a little bit off. You can do maybe a science experiment and get a result that's like 0.02 units different from the official result. Or a lot of times you can miss a math question, but if the teacher looks and she sees that your math, like the process was good, you just couldn't read your own writing on a certain step and you added the wrong numbers or something like that, you'll often get like half credit. On the SAT, that will not happen. The SAT and the ACT both are highly, highly detail-oriented. So you need to be highly detail-oriented, down to whether there's a comma in something or not, right? Down to an SAT question might talk about a linear function versus just the word function. And most of us wouldn't even notice that difference if we read it, couldn't maybe even describe it. But that word linear, that single word, makes the right answer right and the wrong answer wrong on that particular question. So the first thing you need to think to yourself is, I can't just look at these questions and try to get a general gist of what it's asking about and put down what I think is probably like in the right ballpark, like I would in a classroom discussion. There is a very specific way that everything on a test like this is phrased, and you need to read that very carefully, very specifically, and react in the exact right way that they want, and that's how you'll always be able to find the correct answer. Again, we'll get into how you do that, but that's the overall goal, right? So you need to get away from the idea of just trying to be mostly correct, which is fine in school. On these tests, if you are mostly correct, you are completely incorrect, right? You need to be totally correct. Every single word in the choice that you pick needs to be accurate. If the answer that you got on a question is 13, if it's a math question, and one answer choice is 14, and one answer choice is 15, and one answer choice is 12, you didn't actually find any answer choice, right? If 13, the thing that you arrived at is not one of the answer choices, you're totally wrong. You can't just pick something that's close to 13 and hope it's going to be kind of correct. It will not be correct. Okay? So again, we need to get ourselves in a very detail-oriented way of thinking, which also, once more, kind of makes sense because the test is being given to millions of people. If you're going to make reliable distinctions among millions of people, you got to be pretty detail-oriented, right? If you're not, then this results of the test will not be very useful for anybody. Okay, so let's talk about specifically how to allocate your time on particular mistakes. This is another thing that people often have a very difficult time sort of grasping at first. So most SAT takers, for instance, will think, okay, on the last test I saw, I don't know, a dozen words or something that I wasn't sure of. Let me learn those words. And actually, not just those words, let me go back and learn 100 words or 500 or whatever it might be, right? The problem with this is, excuse me one second, bad time for my nose stitch. The problem with this way of thinking is that challenging words actually don't cost most people as many questions as they think that they cost them on the SAT. If you sit down and actually count, like if I work with a student or something and we go through a section, we actually count, okay, where did the mistakes come from here? The student might say, well, I missed a lot of questions because I didn't know a lot of words, but you might look and find that, okay, there were 3 words that the student didn't know, but they were all in the same question. Meanwhile, the student missed 3 other questions on that section where he knew all the words and did something else wrong, right? So the student focuses his energy on the frustrating part, which was missing those words, not knowing them, feeling powerless against that question. But actually, that only cost him, in this example, 1 point. The stuff that cost him the other points was less frustrating at the time and is actually going to be easier to fix if he notices them. But if you don't pay attention to them, then, you know, you're not going to get the benefit from it, right? So most people ignore their so-called careless errors. That is a huge mistake. The careless errors are actually, generally speaking, the things most people should focus their attention on. Most test takers, again, this is not everybody, but most people, most test takers are looking to make a test score that's a little bit better than their grade point average would indicate that it should be, right? So let's say, I'm just going to make something up. Let's say you got a 3.5 grade point average and your test scores are like sort of in, on the SAT, sort of in that 1800, 1900 range, let's say. I'm just making up some numbers. Well, with your 3.5, if you were to get a perfect score on the SAT, your grade point average is still not that competitive against other people who might have perfect scores on the SAT and perfect grades. So really, you just kind of want to use the test score to nudge yourself up into the next threshold of competition, let's say. So that might mean that you need only 50 to 100 points, 150 points, something like that. Again, not everybody, but some people. And those 50 to 100 or 150 points usually equate to somewhere on the order of 12 to, I don't know, 18 questions correct, something like that. 18 questions more than you had before. Usually, if you just focus on the things that you misread, or the math that you didn't check, or the stuff that you hurried through, or the way that you read a passage too quickly and thought that it said one thing, but it actually says exactly the opposite. If you just fix those so-called careless errors, you will find yourself usually either all the way to the target score that you wanted, or most of the way to the target score that you wanted, and then from there you can focus on other things. Right? Does that kind of make sense? So don't sit and think, well, man, the last time I took the ACT, there was this one passage on whatever, and I was just so bored by it, and I did horribly on it, and that's really going to get me next time. Don't think like that. Instead, think, okay, last time I took the test, let me go back and look at my questions that I missed. How many of them are questions where when I look back at them later, I go, actually, I knew that. You know, I can't believe that I multiplied 3 times 7 and got 18. I can't believe I did that. Or I can't believe that I picked this answer choice on the passage that says exactly the opposite of the passage instead of the one that says exactly the same thing as the passage, or whatever, right? Those are the things that you need to focus on if you want to make the biggest bang for your buck as quickly as possible. And like I said, for most test takers, just focusing on that by itself will be enough to get you where you need to go. One thing that sort of follows immediately from that is that most test takers will find that vocabulary drills for the SAT in particular, but also for the ACT, are not as helpful as you might want them to be. They can be helpful in certain situations for certain people. If English is not your native language, for instance, it might be more useful than if it were your native language. Even then, I would focus on vocabulary words that relate more to math concepts or to words like argument, or I don't even know what. undermine, kind of words that you actually would see in the prompt of a passage question, not in the answer choices of a sentence completion question. Just because learning those hundreds of words or even more generally doesn't give a very good bang for your buck, because they generally don't appear in questions in situations where knowing them would actually help more than knowing how to answer questions in general. So again, try to focus your energy in the places where it's much more likely to pay off for you. Along the same lines, click my next button, here we go. Along the same lines, oops, I have a question coming in, sorry. Pause myself. Jesse says, is it true the ACT matters more than GPA and, oops, hold on a minute, and other things? Very good question, Jesse. I'm glad you asked. And again, anyone who has any questions on anything SAT, ACT, or college related, please, by all means, feel free to jump in. The answer to your question, Jesse, is that it depends on the situation very heavily. In general, I would say that it doesn't matter more than a person's GPA, but it can in some cases. It doesn't matter less either, in some cases. So it depends on the threshold, or let me put it a different way. It depends on, first of all, what your situation is, what kind of school you're trying to apply to, what your numbers actually are. For instance, I have a friend who was heavily involved in admissions for what you might call a regional public school. It was like a state school, but it mostly drew from people like in and around that region of the state and sort of the surrounding states and so on. So not like an Ivy League, but kind of selective school to get in. And what he explained, which I didn't know before he told me this, is they would take like all of their applicants and they would enter all their scores and their GPAs, recalculated GPAs, into a spreadsheet. And then they would sort of rank the spreadsheet by GPA and score together. And then everybody above a certain number was automatically admitted. So, in that case, it makes a pretty big difference what your test score would be. On the other hand, if you're applying to an Ivy League school or a very selective school that prides itself on being a bit more holistic, let's say, the test scores still do seem to matter, but GPA also matters. What else matters? Things like extracurriculars, maybe letters of recommendation, personal statements, projects that you complete and submit to them, kind of show, okay, this is something I'm interested in, like outside of my own schoolwork. It shows I'm a good student and so on. You have a whole range of situations. If you're an athlete, for instance, then it might be that a test score by itself is enough to get you, clearance at the NCAA. Or it might not, it depends. In a lot of situations, there's kind of a sliding scale between the GPA and the test score, right? So a super high test score might compensate for a kind of low GPA in certain scenarios, or it also might not. So I'm afraid I can't give you a more concrete answer without knowing specifically which schools you're applying to and without doing a little bit of research to find out what those schools' policies are. But it is extremely true that the ACT can be, for sure, just as important as the GPA. And a lot of people would say, well, that's kind of awful. Like, why would that be the case? You work so hard for your grades and then, there we go. You work so hard for your grades and then you have this, one-day test and that's going to count the exact same as my grades. Like, why would that be fair? But you have to look at it from the college's standpoint. Different schools measure grades in different ways. Different students take different classes from different teachers every year, So if you're a school and you're looking at two applications and one kid took whatever he took, let's say advanced placement classes, a lot of sciences and so on, his GPA is a 3.7. You're looking at somebody else and she maybe went to a school where they didn't have advanced placement classes, but she took all the science things that she could, and she went to Alpha Theta and things like that, and her GPA is a little bit higher, but her classes are maybe not as hard, or maybe they seem not as hard, or whatever. It's very hard to compare those two students. But if one student has an ACT score of 33 and one has an ACT score of 29, and the ACT is basically the same every single time that it's given, then as the college you have a bit more trust in that distinctive factor. So this is why the test scores are often given a significant amount of weight in the admissions process. But I can't say for sure how it would go for any particular student. Really, nobody can except the actual person at the school who's looking at your thing. But I couldn't even say in general what you should expect unless I could know specifically what your grades were, what your test score was, and where you were thinking of applying. I could give you a more concrete idea there. But Jesse, if you look at those particular schools, go to their web pages and go to their frequently asked questions sections for applications and things like that, and try to find out what their thresholds are for test scores and GPA. And that is also generally going to be broken down by race and gender as well. So kind of factor that in too. If you do all of that stuff, you can get a roughly certain idea of what kinds of scores and grades you need to put together. I have a couple other questions coming in. We have, by the way, about 5 minutes left. Question, do I have any recommendation on how to study, whoops, 1 minute, sorry, gotta scroll. Okay, how to study or math classes to take a test by watching videos online. Actually, Arlete, or I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, could you please kind of rephrase that? What I think I'm understanding from your question is, do I have any suggestions on how to get better at math, maybe, with respect to the SAT and the ACT? So the way that you do that, I will try to give you the 2 or 3 minute version. Well, it kind of goes back to the things we talked about in this video. It's not just about knowing more math. It's about knowing how to apply the math in specific situations. And again, for many test takers, if you could just kind of not make the small, careless mistakes you tend to make, that would often boost your score up into the range that you want it to be in. Again, some people will have to do more than that for sure. But for a lot of people, that actually gets you a lot further than you might think. So what I would do probably is this. Whoops, kind of follow-up version. There are several videos with math lessons. Yeah, okay, I think I know what you're talking about. There's classes like on Khan Academy, Khan Academy, and some other ones as well. Actually, many, many other ones, where you can learn math, you know. So like if you don't know how to find an integral or something in calculus, you can go on and Google that and you'll find people teaching it to you. By the way, I see your question also, Dalt, and I will come to that in just a moment. So yeah, you can go online and learn really anything, not just math. I mean, anything, any foreign language, history, like anything you want, you can learn. So yeah, you can certainly learn math as well. The question is whether that's likely to help with the test or not. If you already know the basics of algebra, geometry, arithmetic, and those kinds of things, it's not very likely to help to go learn more advanced arithmetic, algebra, geometry. Like, it's not going to help you to know theories of prime numbers or the proof of Fermat's last theorem or things like that when you take the SAT. It's not relevant to that. So in that sense, I wouldn't really recommend anything like that. What I'd recommend more is actually trying practice tests and then kind of reviewing it in ways described here. Or also, like I said before, if you kind of Google the previous version of this lecture I gave for CWL, you can find more tips on that as well. So yeah, if you know the basics of the math, then learning more math is probably not going to help. If you don't know the basics of the math, it's up in the air whether you could learn it from a video or not. It depends. You know, if you've been sitting in geometry class, let's say, all year, and you didn't learn how to find the area of a circle from your geometry teacher, it's unlikely, in my opinion, I could be wrong, but it's unlikely that if you watch a video on finding the area of a circle, it's suddenly going to make sense in a way that it didn't make sense when you had the textbook in front of you and the teacher and all that other stuff. So it would depend. But what I would do first is try to get solid in those areas. Again, for the SAT, basic arithmetic, basic algebra, basic geometry. If you're solid there, you can, in theory, answer any SAT question. On the ACT, it's that stuff plus basic trig. I would get solid in that. Maybe with the teacher's help, maybe with videos, whatever it might be. Then I would try looking at practice tests, practice questions, and sort of going over my mistakes. It's a laborious process. It's a bit slow and time-consuming, but go over my mistakes and kind of think, well, how did I miss this question? Or when I saw this one, I didn't think I had any idea how to answer it, but I know Mike told me that it's got to be just basic algebra, arithmetic, and geometry. So how could I combine those concepts? And at first, it's very, like I said, slow, but the better you get at it, the faster you will get in the future. And that's kind of in general how I would recommend that you proceed. Dalt says, again, any tips for slow readers? I struggled on the ACT, hoping for less long reading on the SAT. Yeah, I do have tips for that. I'm trying to think how to condense them. Basically, I'll say it like this, Dalt. You don't need to understand what you read. I think that's one of the big things people run into. On some cases, in some situations, thanks, Arlete, for thanking me. You're more than welcome. But Dalt, yeah, in some situations, for sure, you do want to understand. I mean, absolutely, there's things you need to understand on the test, no question. But if you had, let's say, like a page-long passage on the SAT and the ACT, you're not going to be asked questions on every single concept in that passage. Never. It never happens. There's not enough questions there. Even if they asked you one question per sentence, there's not that many questions. So, when you have a long passage like that, you don't have to understand all of it. You only have to understand the little bits that you're asked about. A lot of people spend a lot of time trying to process what's being said and really get it, and you don't have to. So I would start with that. I would start with the idea of seeing if maybe you could kind of cut down the amount of stuff that you devote your energy to. Beyond that, yeah, it kind of varies. Some people, this sounds kind of ridiculous, but some people actually can read faster if they just make a conscious effort to read faster. Not everybody, but some people. Just a few things you can start, kind of thinking about with that. Actually, I just thought about this. If you go on my blog, if you Google, how would I Google it? Probably if you Google Mike Barrett, testing is easy, speed reading, which is 2 words, speed reading. If you Google that, I actually made a set of videos on how to read faster for standardized tests. I forgot about that. It was a while ago. But you can find those. People have found those useful. They're free. You just go ahead and look at them. That'll give a better explanation than what I was able to get to just now. But yeah, take a look at that. Okay, guys, this is my time. I don't see anyone else asking any questions. I'm just going to put up my little say goodbye slide here. I have a book on the SAT. It's available on Amazon. It's called the SAT Prep Blackbook. Another one is coming out on the ACT, hopefully in a couple of weeks. Anyway, you can go ahead and take a look at that stuff on the screen if you want to know more about me or how to find out more specific, advice for different test questions and things like that. Catherine asks, how do you combat testing fatigue? That's a great question. I will be really fast because I'm a little bit over time already. 2 things. Well, really, at least 2. One thing is fatigue sets in when we're doing something that we don't really enjoy doing and that is challenging for us. If we enjoy doing it, or if it's not that hard, fatigue usually doesn't set in. So you kind of want to change your attitude, for one thing. I mean, I'm not saying you have a bad attitude. That's not what I mean. But if you look at the test like this grueling thing, then it's going to be grueling and it's going to be horrible and everything. If you can kind of come to see it as a game, which is how I always encourage people to look at it, it's not that bad. I could sit down and watch football for a day. I have literally sometimes killed 14 hours in a day watching football, and I don't feel it at all, right? Or play a video game, or talk to someone that you care about, or play chess, or any kind of thing like that. You can do that for a long time if you like it. The reason why we can't generally do the SAT for 5 hours without wanting to, beat our head against the wall is that we're looking at it like this challenging thing. So again, if we can kind of change our mindset, make it a bit more of a game, that's one thing. And that sounds ridiculous, but it's actually true. The other half of that, though, if you can make it easier, that's usually going to be easier to do. So if you understand how these tests work, what you find is that they ask the same types of things over and over and over again for 5 hours or 4 hours or whatever it is. So like every SAT reading question basically rewards the same thing. Every ACT one as well basically rewards the same thing. Once you know how to do whatever that thing is, you don't spend that much energy doing it. And you can do it a lot more without, wanting to stop than somebody else who has to struggle with it. Same thing with a math question, science question, whatever. If you know the easiest ways to approach those things, then you don't have to worry so much about approaching them. So, yeah, that's 2 things right there. 1 is try to see it as more of a game. 2 is, honestly, the better you get at it, the less fatiguing it will be. A third thing you can do, which is something I kind of have stolen from Olympic athletes, it's brutal, though. I don't totally recommend it, but it works. If you get in the habit of taking 3 practice tests in a row, basically spend your entire waking day once a week taking practice tests, which I don't recommend. I wouldn't personally do it. But if you do that, then when you go in on the real day and take only 1 test, it seems like a breeze. So you can kind of use that athletic training trick of getting the person used to doing more, and then when they do less, it seems easy. But again, that's brutal. I think the much better thing is to focus on actually refining your approach to the test so that it takes less energy, and then also to try to kind of see it as a game. And those 2 things kind of go together, because the more you refine your approach, the more you realize it is just a game. I mean, it's just the same thing over and over again, like a video game, like Tetris or something. Does anyone even know what Tetris is? When I was your age, Tetris was a thing. I don't know if Tetris still exists. Like Candy Crush or some other game like that. I don't play games anymore. But, you know, those kinds of things, it's just the same thing over and over. You kind of get into a rhythm, and then it's not so stressful. I see there are still some people in here. I think I'm technically over my time, but they haven't like actually kicked me off yet. So if anyone has any other questions, I'm happy to answer those. If not, then I will go ahead and click to end the conversation in a few minutes. So, wait, what is this? There's like a whole other set of people here I didn't know about. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Samantha's been telling me I need to stop. Okay, sorry, Samantha. I didn't see that there. I need to get out of here. So thank you very much, everybody, and I appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to me on my blog or whatever if you have any follow-up questions, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks also to College Week Live for putting on this phenomenal event for everybody, and I hope that you students are all enjoying what they've put together for you, because I know it takes them a lot of energy to do it. And Samantha, sorry, again, I only saw Kimberly's message. I didn't see yours, so I didn't follow your thing. Okay, I will get out of here now. Thanks, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.